My name is Annabelle. I'm a junior in computer science major. I'm very, very excited to introduce Dr. Danah Boyd, who is one of my research heroes, and I think you'll see why very shortly. Dr. Boyd is a principal researcher at Microsoft Research, the founder and president of Data and Society, and a visiting professor at New York University. Her research is focused on addressing social and cultural inequities by understanding the relationship between technology and society. Her most recent books, It's Complicated, The Social Lives of Networked Teens, and Participatory Culture in a Networked Age, examine the intersection of everyday practices and social media. She is a 2011 Young Global Leader of the World Economic Forum, a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, a director of both Crisis Text Line and Social Science Research Council, and a trustee on the National Museum of the American Indian. She received a bachelor's degree in computer science from Brown University, a master's degree from the MIT Media Lab, and a PhD in information from the University of California, Berkeley. Finally, an interesting fact that Dr. Boyd shared with me is that she's run a lyrics website for the Museum Annie DeFranco for the last 25 years. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Boyd.
It is so exciting to be here with you today. I've been learning more and more about the fellowship program that many of you are embarked on, and what an amazing opportunity. So I hope you are relishing every moment of it. The talk that I prepared for you today is meant to think about unstable democracy. And I'm going to do it in this strange way that marries these questions of political, social, information issues with one of technical. So my title won't make sense, hopefully, till the end. But in the meantime, let's sort of dive in. So a decade ago, many of you were quite young, and you probably heard that the internet was full of sexual predators. I was living in this environment where that panic was a conversation everywhere I would go. When I talked about social media and the possibilities of social media, everybody'd say, no, 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 this is a place where kids are going to be kidnapped. We should never allow it. And there was a rhetoric that we needed to do everything possible to stop sexual predation. Now, I'm not going to stand here and be pro-sexual predation, but the question at play was, what were we actually afraid of? Were we afraid of reality, or were we afraid of a set of myths that were unfolding? At the time, there were various laws that were being proposed, and my favorite was the Deleting Online Predators Act. The Deleting Online Predators Act would have forbidden anybody under the age of 18 from interacting with any website that had a comments feature. So think the New York Times, for example. It was a great moment. Most people on the Hill didn't understand any aspect of technology, and the Attorneys General of the United States had created an Internet Safety Technical Task Force in order to find out what the solutions to sexual predation were. Now, as a researcher, I thought this was an interesting challenge, so I agreed to help support this effort. And I spent a tremendous amount of time going into every detail of sexual crimes committed against young people, how they unfolded, where the intersection of technology hit, all these other axes that would be relevant, and came back with a beautifully prepared report of where the real risks lay and the different kinds of possible interventions that we might be able to make. Unfortunately, I was not prepared for the politics of the day, and one of the Attorney General literally spit at me and said, "Go find different data. I don't like what you found." I was like, oh, this is going to be odd. So teenagers, meanwhile, were really split on the topic. Some were actually afraid. They had watched various shows like To Catch a Predator, and they were convinced that predators must be everywhere. Others had had encounters with strange, primarily men, and were a little wary. But a whole other group of people were kind of ambivalent. And I mean that in both senses. They were both like, meh, but also that they were strongly had feelings about this rhetoric. They didn't see the internet as dangerous, and they thought the fears were overblown. More importantly, they thought it was another way for adults to make their lives a living hell. So they wanted to respond. Now, at the same time, there was a site that had emerged known as 4chan. How many of you in this room are familiar with 4chan? The rest of you, I recommend reading the Wikipedia entry and going no further. At the time, it was referred to as the underbelly of the internet. We have now found underbellies to the underbellies, but we'll work with that. It was popular amongst a group of primarily teenage boys. It was created by a 15-year-old white boy who believed that he wanted to have a site to do what all boys of his mindset were interested in, which basically boiled down to pornography and anime, which were really the two animating features of this site. Well, the problem is that his mother had control over his internet connection, and as the site started getting more and more popular, he was deeply concerned that he was going to get in trouble for creating a site in his bedroom. So he decided to introduce a feature to it, and that feature was to not allow anything to stay on the server past the first page. So once something was posted, it would work its way down in the reverse chronological order that you're now familiar with things like Twitter or anything else. But once it hit the bottom of the page, it would disappear for good. And that actually created a whole set of responses, what we now think of as the predominance of meme culture, right? Because the idea was if something was going to disappear off the page, let's just take it and put it back to the top. So this group of folks was having fun at the time, especially around 2008, messing with what they thought of as adult establishments of various form. And they really, really, really liked watching Tom Cruise be ridiculous. Because at the time he was obsessed with Scientology, and they loved this. So they were hacking into different services to find Tom Cruise saying highly ridiculous things about I'm not even going to go there. And part of it is they wanted to point out this hypocrisy. And so they started staging these various campaigns. This is the birth of something that is now known as Anonymous, which became very political very fast. Anyhow, we're still back in 2008. And so this set of folks who were really thinking about the internet as a place to just cause different kinds of mayhem decided to mess with Oprah. Now, here's the situation. Oprah Winfrey was very much tapped into the conversation about how the internet was filled with sexual predators and that they were the greatest risk to children. She decided to dedicate show after show after show to this topic. And that really upset some of these people who were living and having fun creating memes, and they decided to mess with her because they wanted to see if they could get her to say something ridiculous. So they started doing what we now refer to as trolling. They started going on to all of the places that they thought her producers might be looking by posting different things. And they managed to get Oprah to say live on national television. Let me read you something which was posted from our message boards from someone who claims to be a member from a known pedophile network. It said this: he doesn't forgive, he doesn't forget, his group has over 9,000 penises and they're raping our children. So I want you to know they're organized and they have systematic ways of hurting children and they use the internet to do it. Now, if you know much about internet subcultures, you'd bold over laughing at this. Over 9,000 is a well-known anime references. He doesn't forgive, he doesn't forget is well-known within trolling cultures. They trolled Oprah. Oprah refused to acknowledge that she was trolled and continued to talk about how she was in constant conversation with known pedophile groups. So, why was this such a ridiculous moment in time? I grew up amongst security hackers. We hacked into all sorts of internet apparatus. We hacked into the Navy because we just wanted to prove that we could. It was fun. It was hysterical. We didn't understand it was illegal. That took a few more years. The trolls of the next generation were very much trying to hack into the attention economy. They wanted to shape and shift who was actually controlling the information landscape. Now, this was one example, but there were actually many, and they intersected with all of these different moments that were both political and commercial. So Time magazine arrogantly used to say that we could figure out who the top 100 people were, and most important people, by surveying the internet. Do not survey the internet if you want to get reasonable data. And so when the various online communities started messing with them, they said, no, we've got this, and we found different ways to check that it's not being listed. They decided, I don't even know why, to put the founder of 4chan, to allow him to be at the top. As you know, he did get so many votes. But what was really important of it was not just that he was at the top. They printed the entire list, which read, if you looked at the first letter in alphabetical order, or read in sort of along the first side, it says marble cake, also the game. This is also not something to look up. The point is that it was a total in-joke. And so they didn't just play the first person, they played the entire list, right? And company after company thought that they would make leaderboards. You know, you have Bodie McBoatface, like you have a whole set of these just different moments. My favorite as a Pennsylvanian is the beginning of trying to mess with Google bombing. my senator at the time, he decided to say live on national television that he didn't support gay marriage because then he would have to also support bestiality and pedophilia, and he did a couple of other highly inappropriate things. And as a result, various activists decided that they should make certain that he didn't forget what he said. And Dan Savage decided to memorialize the moment. So they sort of talked about what they would do, and they decided to create a website for his last name, and that his last name should forever go down in history, making a reference to anal substances of varying forms. And so I invite you to Google his last name because it has never gone away. Right? This is the ways in which you hack the attention economy because it's funny, and it's really hysterical. And this was a lot of the mindset in the mid 2000s. And then things got serious, right? How many of you know what Gamergate is? So I'm not going to be cruel and ask you to explain it, because explaining Gamergate is part of the biggest challenge of trying to nail Gamergate down. Gamergate is both rooted in a particular moment of time that occurs when two people have a very ugly breakup and various things unfold that begin with what would normally be a relationship disagreement into something that becomes a serious form of large-scale harassment. It is at the same time it morphs and is used, ironically, which we will get back to, as a way to say that we need to have a serious conversation about ethics in game journalism, which at the time was used to dismiss and reject women's participation and the questions of diversity within gaming. But the reason why this was so important is not because we can nail it or bound it or discuss it, but the ways in which it unfolded, that it actually really eschewed the ability to be bounded. And in its ability to not be bounded, it normalized a level of misogyny and racism that became pretty commonplace because people started finding ways of using language in the most slipperiest of slippery ways. They also figured out a set of functional tactics that began coordinated. And I'm going to say they very amorphously, because people who identified with Gamergate really ranged the span, from people who really do feel as though there should be an ethics conversation about journalism to people who were very much using that rhetoric to hide for different set of reasons. But what was really important is that the tactics of doxing, right, really being able to go after, identify, and find the personal identifiable information of individuals gets matured during this window. The same thing occurs as something like swatting. Swatting is the idea of calling up the SWAT team, SWAT team, and saying there's a bomb in this hall and having the SWAT team show up. And it's a way of actually taking a harassment campaign from the digital into the physical. It is also where we see a whole set of new ways of building out what we think of now as bots and a variety of other campaigns. The other thing that was really important about Gamergate is a coordination of a variety of different actors who before had not actually come together on the internet. So Gamergate really did start out as a conflict and a set of dynamics within gamer culture. And we can talk about the toxicity of gamer culture, but a lot of it was rooted within gamer culture. But gamer culture actually started to morph at this period. First, the men's rights movement, which was actually began in the 1970s as a way of making certain that men had the ability to get, say, paternity leave or the ability to actually be recognized as primary caretakers of children, had morphed into one that was anti-feminism, now rhetorically referred to as anti-social justice warrior. That through line starts to really come together in Gamergate. So you have people who were in it for the fun and are having laughs and all of this, suddenly coming in with this version of toxic masculinity. Meanwhile, white nationalist organizing, which had occurred for a long time in sub-Usenet forums and to various sites like Stormfront, et cetera, also start to come in here. Right? So you get this amalgamation in 2014 of a whole set of breed of toxic behavior mixed with humor, irony, and joking around to a point where you can't tell what's real and what's not, which is part of the point, because that's actually a way of normalizing, especially racism in this environment. This all breeds, and they learn new tactics and new techniques. There's an old notion that comes in the earliest stages of internet referred to as Poe's Law. It actually came from a forum dedicated to Christianity. And the comment was, without a winking smile or other blatant display of humor, it's utterly impossible to parody a creationist in such a way that someone won't mistake for the genuine article. Right? So the notion was that people could be using Nazism as a joke, as irony, as sarcasm. And on the internet, you couldn't tell if you were dealing with Nazism for real or if you were dealing with Nazism ironically. And that became a recognition within this environment of how to deploy language in a more sophisticated way, often to enable and propagate hatred. Okay, red pill. Another fun part of online subculture. So this actually refers back to the days of The Matrix. It's a 1999 film when Morpheus says to Neo, "You take the blue pill, the story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want. You take the red pill, you stay in Wonderland, and I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes." You'll recognize these terms because you'll see rabbit hole as a constant term with regard to internet culture. This all comes from the early days of The Matrix. Matrix conversations start emerging in Usenet, primarily, which is interesting, in 1999, and then they sort of move their way through internet subcultures with an idea of like, what is reality? Who is actually duping us? This fits into, at the time, the conversations around globalization. So the idea of where is the money flowing in globalization and how do we use this as a progressive idea of mobilizing. But it flips, and it flips at the same sort of moment. It flips into something that is referred to in neo-reactionary. So the questions of whether the present-day environment are acceptable, and the neo-reactionary argument is saying we have to go back. So you have this conversation that's emerging about like, how do you position people? What does it take to wake somebody up? And you have this two-part conversation of being woke within progressive culture and waking up that comes within neo-reactionary culture. You also have a component where this is about like figuring out who gets to do that work, who enters the rabbit hole, what it means to enter the rabbit hole, and whether or not that is something by choice or whether you push somebody down the rabbit hole. Again, if you know your Alice in Wonderland, you'll see this sort of dichotomy and how it comes back. It also means that we see these sort of languages start to shift as we see meme culture, neo-reactionary ideas, and red pilling start to emerge, because the idea that you can actually take and open up to these ideas, you will begin to adopt a form of neo-reactionary thought. So you start to see something that begins with a critique around politically correct language. It begins with a critique around freedom of speech, and it starts to actually be used. Those very strong ideologies that have worked for some years. I mean, freedom of speech has a long history of going back, and a long history in particular in the civil rights movement of being associated with opening up spaces for voice, become perverted as this funnel for actually asking much more ideologically toxic ideas. So you have this perfect breed. Let me give you Dylan Roof. In 2012, it was really hard to avoid the names of Trayvon Martin and George Zimmerman. I assume many of you in the room recognize those names. It didn't mean that most people in this country did. In fact, for however much was covered in the mainstream media and over the news, most young people actually hadn't recognized those names. And there was a white teenager in South Carolina who wasn't really interested in the news, but he kept hearing these names, and he didn't understand why they were being thrown at him. So he decided to search online and figure out who they were. He went to Wikipedia. And in Wikipedia, he read an article about what was going on in Florida, and he left with the impression that Zimmerman was clearly in the right. Okay? That was his takeaway from it. He was really disgusted and confused why people were defending Martin. Now, he decided he wanted to learn more and try to figure out why people were doing it. In the Wikipedia article, he encountered a phrase that was black on white crime, and he wanted to see what that phrase was all about. He threw that into Google, and what he found was a service known as the Council on Conservative Citizens, which is actually a white supremacist and white nationalist site. He spent the next 2 years going in and obsessively looking at various white supremacy and white nationalist ideologies. and very much spoke in the language of red pilling. In fact, part of why we know what all happened here is because he outlined it all in his manifesto, and it's been confirmed on the back end by the companies. So on June 17th, 2015, he sat down for an hour with a group of African-American churchgoers in Charleston, South Carolina, before opening fire on them, killing 9 and injuring 1. And he was very explicit in his goal. He wanted to start a race war. Now, that language doesn't come out of nowhere. That language comes out of these environments that actually start being part of these connective tissues. Now, the people that I grew up with, who were just sort of finding ways of messing with Santorum, we never imagined the tools and the techniques that we would build would allow this kind of radicalization, but this is what we start to see. And this introduces us to a technical concept, a concept of data voids. Data voids come in the search space. So most of you, I assume, have used a search engine. I'm going to hope so. We'll go with Google as an example. You throw something into Google. Let's say you want to know about basketball. You are going to get millions and millions of hits related to basketball. That's fantastic. A lot of people have written a lot of things about basketball. And then Google is going to have all of its different techniques about what will get weighted, and we can discuss how that emerges. But that's not really relevant here because they have so much data. What happens when Google doesn't have data? That's when we need to start talking about a data void. A data void is a moment when they don't have data or they don't have high quality data. Okay? So I'm going to give you some of the ways in which this is exploited, where you can actually see how this works. I'm going to begin with the idea of manufacturing terms. So the idea is to create a term, fill a lot of content on the web related to that term, right? Build up an idea of a term, make sure that term propagates as far as possible, and then to parlay that term into major news media outlets so that people then search for it, knowing that the results are all going to be toxic. Can anybody guess what the term is that this is referencing? Crisis actor. So the idea here was that that term was manufactured since Sandy Hook. The idea was to parlay that term into the media. They just didn't get very far at each turn. Parkland is where it really takes off. The reason it takes off at Parkland is that you have Anderson Cooper asking David Hogg on national television if he's a crisis actor. And the reason why that's important is that's a boomerang effect, right? Like, it's basically, he's going to, of course, say no, but the whole point was to get him to say no, because the whole point was to get the term itself into the news media. If you get the term into the news media, you can get people to search for the term, and you can invite them down the rabbit hole. Okay? So that's one way this works. Another key place is in a breaking news context. If you were sitting on your phone on November 5th, 2017, it was a Sunday, you would have gotten an alert from whatever your latest news is that there was a active shooting in Sutherland Springs, Texas. My guess is that you've never heard of Sutherland Springs. Nobody had heard of Sutherland Springs. In fact, nobody, literally nobody, had searched for the word Sutherland Springs in 2 years on any search engine. It was a non-existent town as far as things go. And if you had searched for it before that day, you would have gotten auto-generated content from the Census Bureau and from Zillow. You would have not gotten anything related to the town because the town didn't have websites. The town was too small. So all of a sudden, you get an alert, Sutherland Springs. You weren't the only one that got an alert and are trying to look up this information. Various people who have political and ideological agendas saw this alert, and it's a breaking news moment. They knew that there was nothing related to Sutherland Springs in search, so they were going to target it. The way that they then target it is that they start filling content. Now, the key is to start with Twitter and Reddit. Those are the first primary places that Google reads in. So what you see is this flurry of content on Twitter and Reddit related to Sutherland Springs, knowing that that will affect Google. Also targeting Wikipedia in this period, right? Fill it out as fast as possible. Tell it the story you want to be telling it, because it takes Wikipedia editors a period of time to re-edit. But the real gold target is a journalist. You want to get a journalist to cover a story in your frame, because if you know how Google works, journalism is going to be in that top band on any breaking news. And more importantly, as the news breaks, journalism is going to fill the entire front page. So on Twitter, you sit and you pummel journalists. You ask them questions. You pretend to be a man on the street. You might know somebody. You might know something. You just ask things. That is what happens during any breaking news story at this point. And it certainly happened during Sutherland Springs, because Sutherland Springs had a very specific target. Within some of these online communities, the goal, especially as the far right emerges as a concept, which is code in this context for white nationalism, as this starts to emerge, there's this moment of positioning another group, Antifa, as the counter group, right? To argue that Antifa is a violent group, that they are not being held accountable, and that the far right is not actually violent, they're just responding to Antifa. That's the positioning. So whenever there's a white shooter, the goal is to associate the white shooter with Antifa. So what happens is that this mechanism, which had been really played over and over again, targets around Sutherland Springs to all these different journalists. A Newsweek journalist, the first person to go out the gate on a story on Sutherland Springs, immediately recognizes that this is what's been happening, and he's being played. And he writes what is, for all intents and purposes, really decent journalism, detailing how this is a manufactured idea. And then I don't know what went wrong. I don't know what's up with his editor, but his editor clearly doesn't understand how to write a headline in relationship to an information landscape of today. Because the headline is Antifa responsible for Sutherland Springs murders, according to far-right media. Now, if you know anything about Google, they cut off after a certain character count. So for 48 hours, if you searched for anything related to this shooting, all you saw at the top of Google was Antifa responsible for Sutherland Springs murders. That's another way of exploiting a data void. Another way of exploiting a data void is to use a term that has been left behind. Various folks have left behind terms for various reasons. So unless you're dealing with the NAACP, a phrase like Negro is not an acceptable term to be using in a contemporary environment for very good and historical reasons. So that is a term that gets exploited, and it becomes a battle between organizations like the NAACP and people who have a white supremacist agenda. But there's also terms that are more recently and more frequently being left behind. A term like social justice is actually no longer the dominant concept du jour. We get into much more specificity when we're talking about intersectionality. So we start to talk about racial justice. We start to talk a lot more nuance, as we should. But the difficulty is that that means nobody is producing content related to social justice. And so when you search on YouTube, even today, for a term like social justice, what you will get is content that is really toxic. Now, that's fine if you're in a racial justice movement and you're really trying to focus on getting people to racial justice content. But if you're thinking about a typical 15-year-old who may have encountered social justice through a textbook and they go to YouTube to search for it, they are getting radicalizing content. And that isn't even to mention my fourth kind, which are things like, did the Holocaust exist, right? Now, thankfully, ADL has cleaned up some of that. But this world of data voids means that the goal isn't to necessarily just go after and manipulate algorithms or just to go after and manipulate journalism. It is to see the relationships between those institutions and between the data structures that operate as the target of manipulation. Now, why? Why are we living in this context? Let's be honest, this did not come out of nowhere. This is something that we have been living with and seeing evolve in different ways. It is also something that we have to recognize in the United States and our place in. The place of propaganda and the relationship of propaganda is something that the U.S. cannot pretend it has not been participating in since the 1940s, because it has. But there's various different kinds of state actors who have been turning this around. And I want to look at that kind of turn, because that turn is about trying to make it so that people do not actually know what they know, right? Epistemology is the way we know what we know, the way we understand how the world works. And so when we're thinking about epistemological warfare, what we're dealing with is a way of strategically separating that. Is climate change more science fiction than science fact? That's a really interesting question. That question only exists within a particular context where you want to destabilize an understanding of climate data. This is part of a campaign by RT, Russia Today, that has been about purposefully destabilizing things that are in the scientific community. And so by asking this question, they're able to push another narrative. So what that smaller language says is, just how reliable is the evidence that suggests human activity impacts on climate change? The answer isn't always clear-cut. It's only possible to make a balanced judgment if you are better informed. By challenging the accepted view, we reveal a side of the news that you wouldn't normally see, because we believe the more you question, the more you know. Now, if you read that bottom comment without reference to climate, you'd be like, go media literacy, go critique of information, go asking and learning. That's awesome. But that's not how this is being deployed here. This is being deployed here strategically to destabilize confidence in the information ecology in which you work. Now, what's really interesting about RT and this organized campaign, they actually had tons of these. I really recommend looking at all of their flyers. They're pretty amazing from a media critical perspective. But it was also the fact that they knew that those ads would be banned. And in fact, in London, those ads were banned because this occurs long before Brexit, actually. Those ads get banned, they're forbidden, and then RT puts up other ads. This is what happens when there's no second opinion, right? Redacted. And so this is a way, again, of challenging the information landscape. So here we are in a moment where the idea that our information that we have access to is being destabilized, the things that you're not sure what you can trust. This actually is paralleling a process of purposeful, not disagreement over over how to make decisions, but fundamental disagreements of what reality is. Fundamental disagreements about facts, not about opinions of what to do. My colleague Francesca Tripodi was really interested in trying to understand, at this moment of adversarial content, how does it actually get understood on the ground. And she spent time specifically within her community, and she was interested in how conservatives around her were actually understanding this. And so, as an ethnographer, she decided to sort of step back from her community and try to see it from a new light. And she started to go to different kinds of community meetings and started to think about this. And she spent a lot of time going to Bible study conversations. And she started to realize that she's not evangelical, she's Christian, but she's not evangelical. In evangelical communities around her, they were basically using a form of scriptural inference that originally was about the Bible studies that she was familiar with, ways of interpreting and making sense of biblical scripture, but also applying it to the tax reform bill, and also applying it to the speeches that were given by government officials, and also applying it to Google. And what she realized in looking at this is that this moment of how we build knowledge, this moment of epistemology, is something that is very different depending on where you're sitting. The problem is that Google, as she argues, does not build with an idea of media literacy of evangelical communities in mind. It builds within a rationalized, scientific, Stanford-oriented kinds of way of knowing. And so the result is that what the communities she was talking to were reading Google fundamentally differently than how it had ever been designed. And not only that, she was seeing that they were learning how to ask the right question. So instead of Google being a place to go and look for information, it was seen as a place to confirm information. And that those questions of how to ask the right question were being articulated by talk shows, they were being articulated within church, they were being articulated in these different environments. And so she started to realize that there's this disconnect between the kinds of media literacy practices that she was seeing within evangelical communities and the fundamental way in which this technology was designed. There's also a really interesting, this is all happening in a moment where everybody's like, fake news, everything is fake. What are we going to do about fake news? And part of what was really fascinating is I started diving into the things that people were labeling as fake, right? This is fake news, right? Clinton Foundation, I'm not going to even unpack this. This is fake news. So we started interviewing people and saying, okay, well, why are you sharing this? Do you believe this to be real? And you get the response you would expect. That's not real. I know it's not real. So why'd you share it? Because I hate Clinton. Plain and simple. So, but you shared fake information. It just says that I hate Clinton. And you see that kind of dialogue going back and forth. So the things that we mark from on high, that we identify as fakeness, are actually serving a different vehicle. They're serving a vehicle of allowing social connectivity. And in this place, an anti-Clinton sentiment. Now, that's not new. I grew up standing in grocery lines looking at the Inquirer. It was way too much fun. It's not that most people believe that there are UFOs, right? But that doesn't mean you don't love reading about them. There's so much fun to read about, whether you see them in the Inquirer at the grocery store or whether you see them on Facebook. And indeed, when you dive into the logic as to why people are sharing things, they're sharing it because it provides some sort of cultural reason. It's entertaining. It situates their political position. And it means that our analysis when we look at it by trying to label this often misses the very cultural logics in which people are operating. And that's where we're going to come back to epistemology. We actually have to understand how people construct knowledge. And this is where I think that there's something about how this becomes political. And Cory Doctorow, I think, really does a good job of nailing the political component of this. So I'm going to read this. We're not disagreeing about facts. We're disagreeing about epistemology. The so-called establishment version of epistemology is we use evidence to arrive at the truth, vetted by independent verification, but trust us when we tell you it's all been independently verified by people who are properly skeptical and not the bosom buddies of the people they were supposed to be fact-checking. The so-called alternative facts epistemological method goes like this. The so-called independent experts who were supposed to be verifying the so-called evidence-based truth were actually in bed with the people they were supposed to be fact-checking. In the end, it's all a matter of faith then. You either have faith that their experts are being truthful, or you have faith that we are. Ask your gut what version feels more truthful. This is what makes something like RT very effective in its campaign. It's about seeding doubt, making you not confident about what's going on. And so this is why we see these interesting moments. When the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, puts out a report saying that there's no correlation between autism and vaccination, more people in this country believe that there is. Because they're not sure whether or not they should trust the CDC. They're not sure whether or not things are, and they don't trust the media. And if you don't trust the media, you start to believe that the media is telling this to you to cover something up. And that's how we get into these really weird moments where we're not sure what the information landscape is. And that is very politically dangerous. There are serious consequences to amplifying disinformation. And we are at a moment right now where there are two different vectors that is occurring, news media and technology, and they are feeding on themselves. And again, I want to sort of step us back to understand where this has come from to see sort of how it's being used today. So news organizations have been a target for a long time. My favorite horrifying case is a case from 2009. And this is a case that's actually relevant because there's a guy by the name of Ryan Holiday who wrote a book called Trust Me, I'm Lying, where he talked about working for corporate America actors in order to actually spin up and generate what we would now call fake media. But he details all of this, and then he gives this case as his, oh shit, maybe we messed up moment. And I think it's a really important one for that. So in 2009, a pastor of a small church in Florida wanted to spread a message of hate. He posted this sign in front of his church, Islam is of the devil. Locals found it offensive, but few outside of Gainesville, Florida, took notice. They were used to him. They understood who he was. They ignored him. Then he threatened to publicly burn a Quran. Once again, those in Florida ignored him. But anti-hate organizations that were outside of the Gainesville area received his press notice and started to take notice. More importantly, different kinds of bloggers started to take notice, and they start talking about it. And so all of a sudden, the news media, starting with local anti-hate groups, up into bloggers, up into social media, starts talking about this man in Florida who's going to burn a Quran. And so the result is that it starts getting to the point where national media needs to cover it. And sure enough, CNN and world leaders come to him begging him not to do this, saying that this was violent, this was hateful, etc. And as a result of all these requests by different people, he finally decided to back down. One of those requests was from then Secretary Clinton. So all of this, fine, problem solved. The problem is that meant he stopped getting the media attention that he wanted. So what did he do? He burned a Quran, right? And in that process, of course, he invited journalists to bear witness. No journalists showed up, but tons of bloggers showed up. And once again, the cycle went the whole way up. It hits the New York Times. It gets translated into a bunch of different languages. We end up with this content all over the world. Protests start breaking out in Muslim countries. complicated because some of them are actually prepared for this. It sort of capitalizes on other anti-American sentiment. In one of the protests in Afghanistan, at least 12 people were killed, including 7 UN workers. Right? This is that kind of parlaying this stuff up. This is the using of that media. And this is the challenge of when is it that media recognizes that it can't be in the business of amplifying systems when it has been strategically deployed to amplify. Technology also mirrors and magnifies, right? It wants to say that like it can just be a platform and that it doesn't matter what people are doing, but we're at a moment where people are actively manipulated. It's no longer just search engine optimization. It's a form of manipulation that is actually about using the logics of tech platforms against them. Using it to make certain that no matter what they do, they're damned if they do, they're damned if they don't. And they're in a bind and they're all existentially spinning in circles and making a mess of themselves, right? Because they don't know how to get through this. Simple component of it, they actually have no theory of power institutionally, and they have no theory of intersectionality. And the result is that without either of those, they think that they can turn this into a logical content moderation process. And that doesn't work. Meanwhile, the more that the news media is being told that they're being a tool of amplification, they're also being told that they've got conservative bias and that they need to fix this. And as a result, what you have is the Nazi next door story suddenly being legitimized, right? A way of saying, look, we cover all sides. When is it and how do we get to a point where normalizing a Nazi is actually something acceptable? And this is something, again, we can go back into history. Ida B. Wells was fabulous at actually pushing back at this when the Klan was actively using news media of that time in the 50s to actually propel their hateful messages and their lynchings because they knew that they could create spectacle. We are back there. We are back in the moment. She referred to the need to think about strategic silence. When Joan Donovan, my colleague, and I have tried to actually use that, journalists flip out, like, don't tell us we'd be quiet. Here's all the reason we shouldn't be quiet. I'm like, that's nice, but sometimes you need to be strategic. And strategic should be the thing that's really dominating here. So we've been kind of shifting it to strategic amplification, trying to at least get in through the doors. But really, it's about strategic silence. It's about taking what Ida B. Wells knew really well and saying, we do not amplify these kinds of hate. I've been using this within the frame of hate, but let's also acknowledge that this is part of a broader set of media issues. Some of you may be familiar with this Netflix show. It kills me. This Netflix show, it kills me. I'll explain why. In 1974, scholars recognized something called the Werther effect. They found that how the news media would cover somebody's death by suicide would actually shape the likelihood of duplication, right? The copycat effect. And it was about how. It was not whether if, but how. So as a result, journalists came together through the 80s and created a set of codes of conduct about how to cover suicide responsibly, how to point people in the right direction, how to do the right thing. It was fantastic. They started following these norms. And then it all came undone. It came undone because journalists kept saying, well, it's being covered on the news media. It's covered on the internet. It's covered in mainstream media. Here's all the reasons why. It's fine. We're just going to undo it. So 13 Reasons Why comes out. And for those of you who do not know the storyline, the entire storyline is 13 reasons why this young woman died by suicide, where she's connecting it to her the violence that she had witnessed and experienced at her school. And as a result, it normalizes it. For most of us, we watch this show and you're like, all right, it's beautiful art. It's really a well-done show. But for somebody who is actually in a state of duress, it is a terrifying show. It justifies, it normalizes. So I want to give you a sense of the scale. We've undone this in all of news media. All of you now get notifications when celebrities die by suicide. So we have the data on Robin Williams, who died. And to give you a sense of the scale, Columbia researchers measured it. Over the next month, 10% more people died by suicide because of the coverage of Robin Williams' death. 32% increase in the exact mode of suicide, right? Like, that's huge. So those are the moments where we can start dealing with the impact. All right. Gaslighting. Sort of one final concept. 1944 is a movie called Gaslight, where a woman is being manipulated by her husband to make it so she can't tell what reality is. And the result is the movie's called Gaslight. We now refer to this concept of gaslighting, where you start to have an unstable understanding of reality. That is what happens when we pollute information landscapes. That can occur in a domestic violence context, like it did in this movie, but that can occur at large scale. And so all of us in our obsession of like, we need to figure out what's latest being said in the news, what's going on in the Hill, all of this, that enables a kind of collective gaslighting where we stop being able to tell where reality is. And that is strategic, and that can be deployed against populations as a whole, which again, we've seen sort of people thinking about it historically. Orwell, power is tearing human minds to pieces and putting them together again in the shape of your own choosing. This should feel very familiar right now. All right, so why did I talk about this as security? Security I come from a computer science perspective. Security is the recognition that systems are vulnerable and that you need to protect systems. And we think of it in cyber as thinking of protecting those technical systems. I would argue that what we're living with right now is a socio-technical reality, things that are constantly interfacing between the social and the technical and the way in which those interplay are going. And I would argue that what we're facing is a socio-technical threat, one that understands the structure of that and creates new kinds of vulnerabilities, psychological, social, functional vulnerabilities. And so when we think about Secretary Albright, she understood security. It was part of her mandate, thinking about geopolitical security, border security, human security. Many of you here are here in her shadow with recognition of how important the work she's done has been. And one of the things that I think is important, especially as we start to think about computer science marrying what's going on geopolitically, is a recognition that we need new frames of thinking about socio-technical security. And this comes in every aspect of our world. So I am living and breathing the Census Bureau right now. And the Census Bureau is a really interesting, long-standing institution in the United States. It's existed since 1790, and it is flawed in all sorts of beautiful ways in which an institution of that scale and that length could be. And it faces 5 major risks, 5 major threats to its very structures. Legal and political risks. It has faced that since the beginning, since 1790. Think about it. The awfully atrocious racist policy of a 3/5 compromise is fundamentally a political compromise rooted in white supremacy, written into the Constitution to affect the census. So this has been the story of the census forever. And it's built out bureaucratic processes to try to do these resistances. So the other 3 threats are sort of new ones. First, technical threats. This is going to be the first internet self-response census. There's going to be all sorts of new challenges coming to play. We're also in a communications and information landscape that wants to undermine every aspect of the census. And there's a whole variety of actors, domestic and foreign, invested in that. And finally, at the 5th level, we have to think about all of the forms of data pollution. And you can think about, for those who are computer scientists in the room, think about adversarial machine learning, the ability to pollute systems and the kinds of fraudulent behaviors that can occur. I point this out because this is the kind of institution that needs a form of socio-technical resilience in order to exist. Now, at the same time, we actually have to grapple with how our current brand of capitalism is actually also part of this equation. It's in many ways not necessarily visible to people as like how we've actually seen this shift into this new form of capitalism. Many people in this country still believe that we're in a form of 1950s capitalism that is rooted in the idea of actually providing a service or a product in exchange for money, rooted in that. But this version of capitalism is actually obsessed with return on investment. It's financialized fully and through. And the reason why this is important is it's not just our commodities or our commercial objects that are actually financialized this way. So is our news information. Those don't realize, we're at a point right now where over half of the owners of news organizations are private equity or hedge fund actors. They took over local news. Financialized actors took over local news in the 1980s. Did they actually want to run news organizations? No. They weren't of the mind of Hearst or other sort of yellow journalists of the day. What they wanted was the most important asset that those local news organizations had, their real estate. Because they had housing at the center of the 80s where housing became important. They had real estate at the center of the cities, beautiful condo real estate. right? And what we've seen is across all of the country, all of those beautiful mantles of history, including in the New York Times, in the center of Manhattan, have been bought by private equity or hedge funds, right? Because they've taken over the real estate. And they've kept the newsrooms alive for as long as they might feel like it, obsessing over efficiency, obsessing over making it more financially viable until they will destroy it. Because the commitment isn't to journalism. The commitment is to the financial apparatus. And I think that this is really important because as we look to journalism is in this angst of like, how do we make money? Because they are trying to survive within this version of capitalism. And I would argue a journalist enterprise under this form can't survive. And that's very big sociotechnical vulnerability for us. Another major sociotechnical vulnerability as we start to think about the American landscape has to do with how our networks in this country are oriented. So we've had a draft military for a long time. Many people have participated in a draft military, in a voluntary military in more recent years. But all of it actually came undone in 9/11 in ways that people don't recognize yet. We privatized huge chunks of the military after 9/11. And that actually did something really damaging, something that we don't yet really understand the fallout from. For most working class and middle class people in this country, you knew people in the military, okay? And you knew people in the military through the history of the United States. Most upper middle class and wealthy do not at this point know anybody in the military. But more importantly, when that person went into the military, in especially the volunteer period, although it's also true in the draft period, that they would get to know people from other parts of the country. And they would work side by side with those people, not just to serve the nation in a war context, but to learn skills. Most of our historical plumbers, our mechanics, our many of these sort of blue-collar jobs, those were skills that were trained in the military. True for our medics, for our nurses, for so many different roles. And they came out of the military with skills, not being burnt out to the way that they are right now. They came out with skills, really committed to the local environment. But they came out with something else that was really important. They knew people across the country. They knew people who had fundamentally different political, cultural orientations than them. And now, when it's been privatized, what we've actually done is narrow banded it. You actually see these private versions of the military hiring people that are just like everybody else because people want to work together in non-diverse environments, and that's more optimal when you're actually thinking about it in terms of economic efficiency. And so they actually do these narrow banded groups. People do not come out with those networks, and they don't build new skills. And so the military has actually stopped serving as a huge network. One of the only remaining major networks is the one that you're living with right now. You're at this university, and you're meeting people from across this country and around the world. And that is absolutely critical to this project. And your dorm mates are not totally accidentally chosen, right? It's not a total random algorithm. It's trying to figure out how to mix and match and connect you. And this is one of the weird things that happened when Facebook entered the equation. People desperately tried to self-segregate on American campuses. They tried, even before they showed up at college, to find the people that are like them. And this is the thing I invite for you as you think about your relationship to this university, especially as you depart from Wellesley, is to really think about how you build connections with people who are so different than you, because this is one of the few places in which we actually bring people together that way anymore. The other thing I'd say is we have to think about is how to reimagine ourselves as a whole. So Sarah Igo did fantastic work looking at how the average American was the idea we could imagine ourselves as one, we could imagine ourselves as one people, and we could see ourselves in the numbers. And that was part of the census, that was part of Gallup polls, that was our participation in marketing research. And what we're at right now is that we don't want to participate in metricization of ourselves as a whole. And when we don't want to participate in metricization because we want to resist the capital component and the ways of forms of surveillance that are occurring, we also undermine the ability to participate in things like census. And census is the foundation data collection process for our democracy. Without census, without that, we don't have a democracy. So how do we reimagine ourselves as a whole? Another thing for sociotechnical resilience is to think about how to hold people. When I was a queer kid in rural America as a teenager, I got online. It was sort of a pretty phenomenally insane story. And I ran into all sorts of people around the world telling me stories. People whose lives and experiences were so different than mine. And one of my most salient memories as a teenager was talking with a woman who identified as transgender, who allowed me to ask the stupid questions that you can imagine a 14-year-old growing up in a rural America might ask of a transgender woman at that era. I am embarrassed by the things that I asked. And she held me. She walked me through. She talked me through gender. She talked me through sexuality. She gave me a freshman course in gender and sexuality that I will never forget. She held me respectfully, and she helped me understand. And I am forever grateful to her. What we're at right now is a moment where on the internet, we don't hold people. We go online with the people we know. We find solidarity amongst the people that are like us. We don't think about reaching out to the next generation of folks who might be open and might be wanting to be held. And I think of this most painfully when I think about It Gets Better, because that was the real awakening for me. As a researcher, I saw the It Gets Better campaign. Dan Savage put it out. These were great videos, like It Gets Better, LGBT narratives. I was like, yay! Except that I was doing field work at the time, and I was in these communities. And I started talking to kids about this. And I started talking to kids about how when they made a video, no one actually talked to them online, but everybody bullied them back at school. And so then I went through and did 2 years worth of data of all of the young people who died by suicide in 2 years after these videos came out, and looked at the ones who actually made videos and were identified as LGBT. And what I saw broke my heart. All these kids who thought that they would make that video, that they would find community, that they would find somebody eventually to hold them. They thought they would be a part of an online community, and they didn't get that. And it was part of the story. And so this is where we have to ask this question of, like, how do we make an intention to go out and reach out to people online? People are crying out for help. People are out there. And how do we hold them? How do we transition them through their stupid questions, through their confusion, through their anger, through their racism, through their homophobia? How do we hold them through this? We also need to actually think structurally, right? I'm thinking about it in terms of white hat security in a trolling environment. In my era, when we were all messing and breaking into systems, most of us were doing it for a joke, right? As I noted, we realized it was illegal later. There was an interesting split that happened, a creation of what we now know as bug bounties. The idea that you could actually legitimately break into things as long as you were giving back. As long as you were doing something good for it. You got money for it, but you got recognition. I eventually got an OpenGL t-shirt. That was awesome. You got these moments of being acknowledged. And that was a way of cleaving it off. The people that are ideologically, politically, economically motivated are different than people who are just doing it for the fun. Here's the reality of our trolling ecosystem. I have talked you through some of the more horrific components of it, and I've put some of those pieces down. Most of the people who participate in the campaigns that are destabilizing our information landscape are doing it for the fun. And I think about this really personally. My partner is Jewish, and I'm sitting down with my sister-in-law, who is much younger than us, and we're in Israel, right, where she lives. She lives in Israel, and she's a hardcore gamer, and I'm looking over her shoulder. I'm like, what are you doing? She's like, oh, we're just doing this big, raid. And I'm like, that's not a raid. You're making images. Why are you making images? She's like, oh, because it's funny. I'm like, they have Nazi references all over them. I'm like, what are you doing? She's like, oh, it's just funny. I'm like, do you think that's anti-Semitic? Oh, no, they're just joking. And I'm just like, okay, thank you for the meme culture generation, right? That's that moment of those folks who are just doing it because they want to be a part of something. They're trying to be a part of a community, thinking they're participating, becoming a vessel and vehicle for this. And that's where it comes down to this question of how do we quilt together, network together, and think about the very structure of our society, locally, within this country, and across the globe. Because we actually have to start thinking about those networks. We have to find ways to hold people. We have to find ways to ground people, give people community. We who built the internet, those of us who spent so much time building social media sites, we thought the building of the tools would create the community. We were wrong. And one of the things we have to stay with today is that we're at a moment where those tools exist, but in order to enable the community, it's not going to just be the tools. It's going to be folks like you. Thank you.